keep saying all options are on the table. Back in the House of Commons, your business secretary has just announced a formal consultation with business on retaliatory tariffs. How long are you going to give it until you actually do retaliate?
Sure. Here's your rewritten version in simple, clear English with natural flow, proper grammar, punctuation, and expanded to around 1,100 words. The tone is human and conversational, without jargon or overly formal language. Let's dive in. Journalists usually play it safe when interviewing politicians. They tend to keep things civil, ask expected questions, and move on. But this time, things took a sharp turn. The target? Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Starmer seemed to believe the media would treat him gently.
Well, I think, as I say, 9 months ago, the country voted for change, and that is what we're delivering. The national living wage up £1,400. That's a pay rise for millions of people. Waiting lists that are coming down, potholes that are being filled, wages going up faster than prices, and interest rates coming down. We are beginning to turn the page on this, but we also need to call out reform, because they talk about workers' rights, they talk about protecting people at work. But what do they do in Parliament? They vote against legislation that would improve the protection that people have at work. They talk about the NHS, but what would they do with the NHS? They want to charge for it. We believe in an NHS that's free at the point of need. It's a fundamental principle. And whilst we are building alliances, the security and defence of Europe with our partners, what are they doing? They're fawning over Putin, who is the aggressor. They're fawning over Putin, and that's the difference between us. And that's why it's so important that if anybody wants the change that we're bringing to the country in their community, to vote Labour on May the 1st. On the separate issue of tariffs, we are taking a calm approach, acting in the national interest. And the national interest is to continue our negotiations for a deal with the US, which we made big progress on, and to ensure that we work with the sectors and the industries most impacted. And that's why, amongst other things, I had a round table for some of those businesses this morning. But we must act in the national interest. A trade war is in nobody's interest, in my view. But of course, we have to protect ourselves, and that's why we're keeping all options.
Maybe he thought they'd respect the usual rules of political interviews. But that hope fell apart quickly. What happened next was more like a political ambush than a press conference. Reporters dropped the polite tone and went in hard, asking brutal questions that left Starmer visibly rattled. It wasn't the usual back and forth. There was no room for spin, no chance to dodge. Just relentless pressure. Starmer was clearly struggling. He looked cornered, exposed, and politically damaged.
No, look, we've got a long, deep and close relationship with the United States that we've had for decades on defence, on security, and on intelligence sharing. We work more closely as two countries than any other two countries in the world. And therefore it's important we preserve that special close relationship. The same when it comes to the economy and trade. There's a huge amount of trade between us. And I think that nobody wants a trade war. I need to act in the national interest. And the choice before us was whether to jump into retaliatory action with both feet at the get-go, or to continue with our calm approach of trying to negotiate a deal that will mitigate the tariffs. I think the second course is the right course. I'm fortified in that because all the businesses that I'm talking to intensely, particularly those from the most impacted areas, they agree that that's what they think we should do. So I think that confirms that our approach is the right approach. I accept that we need to go further. I accept that we need to preserve our options, which is why all options are on the table. But I think for the immediate task, that is to secure that deal to mitigate the tariffs.
So, what exactly did the reporters say that shook him so badly? And how did he try to deal with the heat? Let's break it all down. To begin with, Starmer was the one who opened the door. He invited questions from journalists, perhaps expecting some appreciation or mild probing. He likely thought they'd be respectful since he was generous enough to give them time. But things didn't go as he hoped. The first hard-hitting question came from Vicky at the BBC. She asked him why, even though the Conservative Party is falling apart, many voters are turning to Reform UK instead of him. It was a pointed, sharp question. In essence, it meant, if the ruling party is collapsing, why aren't you the obvious choice? Why are people still unsure about you? Starmer's response? Classic deflection. Rather than tackle the question head-on, he started talking about the national living wage and fixing potholes in the roads.
The poll that we've got is one that's absolutely guaranteed to drive the conversation. Small changes underlie it, but that doesn't mean it won't be big news. Let me take you through the latest YouGov Sky News exclusive poll, because what it does, Sophie, is it puts Reform UK in the lead. Only by a little bit and only after a small change, but Reform UK in the latest voting intention poll are on 25%, overtaking Labour, who were top, who are on 24%. The Tories down in third on 21%. Liberal Democrats on 14 and Green on 9. Now, I said quite small movements. What's happened to get Nigel Farage's party out in front is that since last week, Reform have gone up 2 and Labour down 3. That's the big change. Those are in the margin of error. So it doesn't suggest necessarily a massive shift. But when you see Reform UK coming out on top, there's no way the political system is going to respond.
That might sound okay on the surface, but it was a clear dodge. He didn't want to face the deeper truth. Many voters don't trust him. Reform UK may not have perfect answers, but they appear to have strong beliefs. Starmer, by contrast, often comes off as unclear and overly cautious. Then, in what looked like an act of desperation, Starmer tried to attack Reform UK by saying they were supportive of Vladimir Putin. It was a dramatic claim. But critics saw it as a distraction tactic.
So you've said you're not ruling out anything in response to Trump's tariffs, but can you confirm to bereaved families of online safety and the British public whether this includes offering concessions on online safety laws and tax cuts for tech billions?
This was a trapdoor question. Sophie is implying that Starmer is willing to toss children's safety in the bin if it means pleasing America's tech giants. And how did Starmer respond?
We will act in the national interests, but when it comes to online safety, I've recently, even in the last few days, made it clear how important I think online safety is. We had a roundtable with the writer and co-producer of Adolescence on Monday. I think it was a very powerful session, which reinforced yet again the risks and threats of social media, particularly in that case with young boys. Young children, young people, and so there are issues of the Online Safety Act that are coming into force pretty quickly. They're very important, and we need to look at whether there's other measures that we need to take in relation to online safety. But we'll act. Of course, we have to act in the national interest, but it's also in the national interest to make sure our young people are safe when they're online. And I think one of the reasons Adolescence was so compelling is because I think any parent or anyone with a relationship with a child, particularly a teenage child, would have felt very strongly that it exposed quite profoundly the risks and challenges, and I don't think we can shrug our shoulders and walk.
When a leader starts accusing opponents of being sympathetic to foreign enemies instead of fixing domestic problems, it usually means they're out of ideas. The reality is, Starmer isn't the challenger anymore. He's in power. But he still talks like he's on the campaign trail, asking people to vote Labour if they want change. The problem? He's already in charge, and people are asking where that change is. Waiting lists in hospitals are still long. Prices are high. Inflation isn't budging. And most importantly, Starmer hasn't clearly explained why people should believe he can fix any of it.
Beth from Sky.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Donald Trump said his tariff announcement will go down as one of the most important days in American history as he unleashed the biggest change in global trade in a century. You know that this is a massive and profound moment. You've also said that there will be an economic impact, but you know how big this is. So can you please explain in concrete terms for working people looking at all of this overnight, what does it mean for them? What does it mean in terms of jobs? What does it mean in terms of their bills at the supermarket, in terms of public services, in terms of taxes? And just quickly, you keep saying all options are on the table. Back in the House of Commons, your business secretary has just announced a formal consultation with business on retaliatory tariffs. How long are you going to give it until you actually do retaliate?
But that wasn't the end of the grilling. Another reporter brought up Starmer's approach to dealing with Donald Trump, a topic that has made him look weak in the past. The question was basically this: are you too soft? Can you really stand up to someone like Trump? The implication was serious, that Starmer would rather avoid conflict than protect the UK's interests. Starmer responded by bringing up the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US. But that phrase has become a kind of code.
Budget. Are you Nigel Farage in disguise?
Nigel Farage didn't even turn up to the debate in Parliament today. Nigel Farage is fawning over Putin. That's not patriotism. That is not what working people need. What I've done is take the duty of Prime Minister seriously, which is to ensure that our citizens...
What it really means is, we'll keep quiet, even if we're treated unfairly. Starmer tried to reassure the public by talking about trade and how nobody wants a trade war. He claimed that businesses support his calm approach. But here's the issue: Trump has already hit the UK with new tariffs. So while Starmer is trying to present himself as a sensible leader who avoids conflict, many people see it as weakness.
Of America, United Kingdom 10%, and we'll go 10%, so we'll do the same thing.
He says all options are on the table, but then immediately rules out taking strong action. That's not leadership, that's surrender, with a fancy label. One reporter even challenged him on his attempts to please big American companies. Starmer had tried to avoid upsetting them.
Thank you, Beth. There's a lot bound up in that question, but it's a big discussion and it's a big set of issues, so I accept that. Look, in relation to what I say to working people and to businesses, I say we are acting in your absolute best interest, and that's what I mean by the national interest. A trade war is bad for working people and bad for our businesses, and I don't think we should jump straight into a trade war. I think it is better if we're able to negotiate a better outcome, and that's what we are attempting to do.
By staying quiet about online safety laws. But in the end, the US still slapped tariffs on the UK. So his strategy failed, and the journalist called him out on it. Caught off guard, Starmer didn't have a real answer. He gave a dramatic speech about protecting people online and referenced a documentary, but he never clearly said whether he would protect UK internet laws or not. It was all talk, no commitment. Then things got even more intense. Another journalist, Beth, went straight for the heart of the issue. She basically said, "Stop with the vague speeches."
If we can, and that's what the sectors want us to do, and so I'm continuing to do that. I think jumping straight into a trade war, I know others are saying, why don't you go straight into a trade war from day one, from the get-go? I don't think that'll be in our national interests, but I do think we do have to preserve our rights, which is why we are keeping all options on the table.
People are struggling. What are you actually going to do for them? It was the kind of question many voters want answered. But Starmer dodged again. He said he was acting in the national interest, a vague phrase politicians use when they don't want to give specifics. He didn't say how jobs would be affected or whether taxes would go up or down. Instead, he rambled about a new global trade era.
I'm now going to take some questions from the media. I've got a list here, so I'll come to this. I've got Vicky from the BBC. Vicky, first, please.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You're talking a lot about the Conservatives' record, but if the polls are right, it's other parties, including Reform, who are winning over their former voters. Why aren't they turning to you? And I have to ask you for your reaction to tariffs, the overnight news.
It sounded more like a motivational talk than a serious policy plan. He claimed to be turbocharging the economy, but for ordinary people, nothing feels turbocharged. Workers, small business owners, and families don't see the benefits. Maybe big city investors do, but that's about it. And worst of all, Starmer keeps asking people to trust him without offering real numbers, deadlines, or detailed plans. That's not leadership. That's just hoping people will believe vague promises. Then came the question Starmer was clearly hoping to avoid: welfare cuts. A journalist asked if Starmer would reduce benefits for the poorest people in the country in order to make up for his own government's financial mistakes. The question was clear, sharp, and brutal. Will the most vulnerable have to pay for your failures? Starmer didn't answer it. You could almost see the panic in his face. Instead of addressing it directly, he tried to move on to the next topic. He mentioned that the next budget is still months away, which is politician speak for. We'll decide later, and we're not making any promises now. By the end of the press conference,
there's a really important moment here that we need to understand, because over the last few months we've been talking about a new era when it comes to defence and security, particularly collective defence and security, and recognising that we are in a changing world going into a new era, and therefore we have to act and lead differently. We're at a similar point for trade and the economy. This is not just a short-term tactical exercise. It is the beginning of a new era. And we need to understand that, just as we've understood it for defence and security, we have to understand the changing world when it comes to trade and the economy. And I'm very concerned that we get this argument out there, because it means that we have to adapt in ways which go beyond the mere question of tariffs. And that's why I've instructed my team to go further and faster on what we need to do to put more resilience, more strength into our economy. And again, I say that to working people and businesses. In addition to what we're doing on the tariffs, we are now turbocharging the changes that we need to make sure our economy is stronger, is in thriving and supporting.
One thing was obvious: when faced with real, tough questions, Starmer had no clear answers. He avoided, deflected, and used political phrases to buy time. And yet, this was exactly the kind of scrutiny leaders should face. Here's the bigger issue. Journalists finally asked the kind of tough, honest questions that citizens want answers to. But can Starmer handle them? And if not, how can the public trust him to run the country? There's also another layer to this.
Warned that Trump's tariffs are going to wipe out economic growth and wipe out the fiscal headroom that the Chancellor built up in the spring statement. Can you guarantee now that in the autumn budget you're not going to have to come back to benefit claimants to balance the book?
This is a sledgehammer to the face. The journalist asked whether Starmer would let the poorest suffer to pay for his weakness. And how did Starmer answer?
The autumn budget is a long way off, and there's a lot of water under that will have to go under the bridge before then. Obviously, my job, our job, the government's job, is to take the steps necessary in our national interest, which is why we're focusing on progressing the deal that we've been discussing with the US, making sure that we are in a position to take other measures should they be necessary, but at the same time continuing and turbocharging the work we're doing on growth and reform and changing our economy. And an example of that is what we've been doing on planning, led by the Deputy Prime Minister, which was scored by the OBR as the single biggest scored factor when we had the spring statement last week. So I'm not going to get into what may or may not happen in 6 months' time. My job is to make sure that we're in the best possible position as we go through the challenge, and it's undoubtedly a challenge, of tariffs that were imposed by the United States.
Opposition parties usually don't ask these kinds of questions. possibly because they know they might be in power someday and they don't want to face the same kind of fire. But journalists have no such fear. Their job is to hold leaders accountable, and in this case, they did exactly that. So what do you think? Can Keir Starmer survive this level of scrutiny? Has he truly failed to deliver on his promises? Is the trust gap between him and the public just too wide now? Let us know your thoughts below. Has Starmer let Britain down? Or is this just part of the political storm every leader must face? Would you like this formatted into an article or post layout for publishing?